to develop Maju Forest-Gillman Barracks have come up repeatedly in conversation over the last few weeks. It was discussed in Parliament, and last Sunday there was also a rally that drew quite a number of people to Hong Lim Park. Now, today's conversation isn't about the loss of green spaces, but rather the civic participation we've seen taking place. So there were the counter-proposals, self-organized town halls, the rally, and a demand for more transparency from the government. Now, we've seen this happen before. Just a few months ago, there was the debate around the Dear You movie where the government had to explain why it wants to hold on to the bilingual policy. Before that, there was the Some Swing Women mural, then there was the U-turn on the SimplyGo rollout, and the government shutting down the Income-Allianz deal. Now, do these episodes reflect a new era of citizen engagement? And does the government need to change the way it engages with citizens? Welcome to The Usual Place, the podcast where we have real conversations about the headlines. I'm Natasha, and today I'm consulting two people. And first, on the couch, I have Assistant Professor of Sociology, George Wong. And George, you're an urban political sociologist and ethnographer by training. And now what you do is you research grassroots organization in urban governance and politics in Asia at Singapore Management University.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And next to you on the couch, I have Jonathan Ng, an independent consultant with more than 20 years of experience in policy, advocacy, and regulation. Now, we have you here because you're also a former civil servant at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the Prime Minister's office before you moved to the private sector, where you worked in multinational companies and startups in Singapore and around the world. Now, you also create content on social media that draws on your experience to explain how government and businesses work. So combined, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about consultation, but I want to start with Gillman Barracks and Maju Forest because a lot has been said about Singaporeans and the way they have advocated for saving the green spaces there. I want to ask both of you, what struck you about how Singaporeans are speaking up about the issue? And George, since you study this, maybe we'll start with you first.
Right. So I think what makes it really very interesting about these two cases is the fact that you have a lot of different people coming up to say, this is what we want to see, right, in the development. And it really, I think, broadens the view of what sustainability, can look like, right? So we have people who are talking about conservation, looking at, saving animals, the flora, the fauna. But at the same time, also residents coming up to talk about, things like livability, right? There are concern about the developments affecting, the pollution in the area and all that, which is a great way, I think, to, kickstart this conversation around what, the people actually really want, right? So it's a broad range that we see here. And we do see, I think, activists and residents coming together to find different ways to also articulate their voice. So in a way, it's a very refreshing, sort of progression, I would say, right, in Singapore society, where we do see residents feeling like they have a say and they can say, right, about these things, and then thinking that this could also, in some ways, mold, right, policy making along the way as well.
Turning to you, Jonathan, is this what struck you the most about the way the conversation went? Because to me, it's surprising. I'm not vested in Gillman Barracks or Maju Forest. I don't live near that areas, but I'm very interested in the way the conversation is playing out. So, Jonathan, what's your take on how this has been going?
Natasha, I think this is a part of a larger conversation about Singaporeans' expectations of the government, as well as of their own role in the whole decision-making process, right? I think there have been legitimate questions about when Singaporeans will be involved in that process, how much influence they actually have on the outcome, as well as whether consultation actually feels meaningful, right? I think this is not new news. Yeah, I think for quite a while now, the Singapore government has also recognized that the social compact has shifted. I think that the old social compact of you just work hard, we'll take care of you, that no longer works, right? And I think the Singapore government knows that. There have been indications of this for quite a while. So if you go back to even our Singapore conversation, which was a nationwide dialogue in 2012, which in itself was a response to the 2011 general election, when I think the Singapore government acknowledged that Singaporeans were becoming more educated and more vocal.
Turning to you, George, the way we've seen people organize themselves during this whole debate about Maju Forest and Gillman Barracks, what motivated people to speak out specifically and very strongly about this issue? Is it because we're all passionate about the environment?
Well, there's definitely a number of reasons for sure. And I think one of the ones that I want to focus on here would be the fact that these are spaces that I think people care for. I think it reminds them of a kind of Singapore that, existed. And, I think it's their way of thinking about how should we be a part of the conversation to, I think, shift development or actually mold the development, right, in ways that make it more co-creative. And it's great that, we see, I think, residents, activists coming up to speak about this, because then you do see that wide range of needs, desires, aspirations around this thing that really help us to, move that kind of conversation that, Jonathan has mentioned about, how it's now not just about, top down, right? Like, I do the policy, you accept it or you don't. Now it's about government saying, let's have a space where we have that kind of conversation. And of course, this time around, this is a great and healthy way to see that conversation building up. And having different views of how that could influence the downstream measures. Right? I think one most important thing that all these developments have is this thing called mitigation measures, right? And how a lot of these interactions, a lot of these aspirations and desires will go to shape the downstream measures like these things, and perhaps build a more sort of co-creative, sustainable development that everyone can feel they had a part to play in.
I mean, that's the impression that people are getting. But we'll get to the whether it translates into anything concrete, because I want to ask Jonathan first. And I know, and I caveat, you don't work for the government anymore. But how would you?
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. But how would you rate? No, seeing them before, say in 2012, and now we're in 2026. How would you rate how they responded to this current debate that people are having about Maju Forest and Gillman Barracks?
What I rated?
5 out of 5 would recommend. Sorry, save you. But how would you say they've done?
I think one of the criticisms that's leveled against the government is it's not listening, right? But I'm not entirely sure that's completely fair to say that the Singapore government is not listening. I think there have been indications that the government is listening. But I think what Singaporeans are quite unhappy about, maybe, is the when and the how in terms of the engagement, right? I think Singaporeans have an expectation of being involved a lot more upstream, rather than for the government to go to them when the policy has already been cooked, right, and present the policy as a fait accompli, because then the consultation feels quite performative, right? I think Singaporeans are now expecting that they are explained to about how decisions are made, what trade-offs were considered, what alternatives were considered, right? And they also want to feel like their voices matter, right? And the things that they say have a genuine opportunity to actually shape the outcome, as George was mentioning earlier. I think the government is trying to shift in that direction, but maybe not as much. Maybe the government hasn't shown people how the proverbial sausage is being made, right? It's almost like there's been a black box after the initial consultation with the stakeholders and the experts. Then there's a black box, and then we present it to people, and then we do a consultation on that. And I think that's what Singaporeans don't expect anymore. They want to be involved much earlier in the process.
Just to add on as well, I think is where I think the government has realized that, hey, different stakeholders have very different expectations about how consultations can be done. Some want to do it towards the end, where it's more of okay, let me know what's the verdict. There are those who want to do it way earlier, right? Because they feel like if they have a lot more, I think, knowledge about some of these developments and all that there could be a more co-creative design or process along the way. So I think what is really shown here is a progression, right? You have stakeholders with very, very different aspirations, very different, I think, expectations for how they are being consulted, why they're being consulted, and when they're being consulted. And I think this is where government is now taking in, right? It's fine-tuning the whole consultative process of, understanding who wants to do what, how, and how do we then bring all these different stakeholders together to sort of work out, right, that deliberative process. And I think this is very healthy for policymaking for sure, because it is not a policymaking process that I would say 30, 40 years ago, right, would have been very, very much possible. Today, I think it is a healthy sort of progression to the kind of, I think, even I would say the kind of policy landscape that government has been expecting, right? You be consultative, but at the same time, you open up to a wider range of, actors, speakers or, stakeholders who have very different views, aspirations, expectations and all that.
And at the heart of it is trust, right? Because I feel like Singaporeans, in order to be able to trust the government, they must also trust that their voices matter. The things that they say actually will impact the outcome, and their concerns are being reflected in this decision-making process.
I think there's that inherent tension there about the perceived consultation. And I want to raise this thing about, on July 30th, there was actually a dialogue that was hosted by MP Rachel Wong, and then so residents raised concerns, but it wasn't just about preserving or saving the greenery that they raised during discussion. So they actually questioned whether the process was transparent enough and whether the consultation was meaningful enough in the sense that it could still change the outcome, which is what both of you are saying. So there's this tension between like, am I being listened to really, or is this just kind of for show, right? And but if you look at it from the government's perspective, they would probably say they've been quite consultative, because at some point during the process, they did ask, or they have been asking for feedback, right? So how does the government have a different expectation on what they see as consultative versus what citizens see? I mean, is there a mismatch of expectations, you think, George?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a mismatch of expectations. In fact, I do see this as a great progression in the sense that it means that society is ready for a bigger room, right, where the policy-making space can invite more people into the space. So when residents tell, their MPs, their politicians that, hey, I want to be consulted, I want to be part of that process where I can see how the sausage is being made. This is good because it means that society is ready to enter a room where instead of just being, I think, told, right, or being consulted that this is the plan, and then to just take in really that minor feedback, just tweak things. Residents are now saying, or activists and stakeholders are saying, I'm ready to do the dirty work, right? Roll up my sleeve, come in with you with policymakers. Let's talk about the nitty-gritty stuff. Which tree should we be planting on, like the development? If we are conserving, right, and strategically conserving, what kind of conservations are we doing here? Should we be doing nature corridors? Where would the nature corridors be cut out and things like that? I think this is so important because we've really gone to this sort of 2.0 of policymaking, right, where policymakers are not just doing it in isolation. They are working with stakeholders to figure that out. And as the room expands, you start to have that co-creative design becoming a lot more, sort of present, right? And people, starting to raise their hand and say, hey, I want to be part of that room as well, which is, I think, very optimistic, sort of.
And I think it's
position.
super impressive because people actually did their research. They didn't just kind of say, oh, I don't like this, you change it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But Jonathan, what's your take on?
I think there are a few aspects to this, right? So I think on the one hand, first, Singaporeans feel like you spoke to those experts, you didn't speak to me, right? So my voice wasn't heard. The second is, you speak to the experts, you do all of this work, right? And then you come to me at a point in the whole policy deliberation process when my voice doesn't really matter anymore, right? What are you even consulting on? You are informing me. It's not a consultation anymore, right? So I wonder whether it would work better if there's almost like a two-stage process, right? So first, the government goes and does all this technical work, speaks to all the relevant experts and stakeholders, right? And then it narrows down the options without actually deciding on one just yet. And then you have a second phase, where you go out to a wider range of people, right, to say, look, we've done a lot of work, we've spoken to all these people. So there's an explanation to let people know that they have spoken to some people. But at this point, we haven't formalized or firmed up our decision yet, right? And we've narrowed it down to these few options. And here are the trade-offs, right? Here are the considerations. Now, what do you guys think?
Yeah.
Then at least people feel like, oh, it's not a fait accompli to me anymore. It's at a point where the things that I say could still influence the outcome. And that's what matters to me.
Right.
Because I feel like I can impact the future of this country.
But will this actually hamper policy making? Because now, technically, you got to listen to not just a few more people, there's a lot more people, right?
Yeah. I'll just get into that as well. I mean, as I think stakeholders come into the room and then start to co-create the process, there also must be the expectation that things will not go their way all the time, right? There can never be one policy design that satisfies every stakeholder, right? Because stakeholders will come in with very diverse aspirations, demands, expectations, and you have to accept that in the process of engaging, process of co-creating, there will be things that they have to give up. There will be things that they have to accept that maybe others find it more important than their own, and they're willing to, have that, sort of say, like, give in, right? A kind of consensus being built here. Because otherwise, if everybody goes in the room thinking, this is my chance to make my voice heard, and therefore my view is the only view that matters in policy making, it's very, very toxic, right? It creates a situation where everybody goes in thinking policy will be my way. It'll make not just policy making difficult for the policymakers, it makes, I think, civil society a very contentious one as well. Everyone thinks it's a very combative situation. So what I think is that there needs also to be that expectation among stakeholders. If you go into the room, be prepared to also make a consensus with other fellow Singaporeans, right, with other concerns, interests and all that, and to really, I think, find that way forward together.
And I think the more you explain the trade-offs to people, right, the more you bring them into the process itself, I think the more society will mature and people will understand that, I can't have everything my way. And I actually think that the Singaporean public, right, isn't so demanding that they expect everything to go their way all the time. I think we are now at a stage where people understand there are trade-offs to be made, right? But if you don't explain the trade-offs to them, right, and you only go to them at the end, then they'll feel like, okay, I'm just never heard, right? But it comes back to your point earlier, Natasha, about how there's an inherent tension, right, for the government, because you want to hear more stakeholders' views, right? But then if you try and listen to everybody's views, then you end up having a situation where you're paralyzed. You can't move, you can't make a decision, right? So I think the challenge now for the government is to find that sweet spot, that point at which you've done enough work and spoken to enough people that you understand the trade-offs without having gone down a particular path so far, right, that any kind of consultation feels like consultation theatre.
So when you speak about trade-offs, and actually this is a kind of like a buzzword in the past 2 weeks, trade-offs, right? So how do you think public officers or even ministers can communicate hard trade-offs without sounding paternalistic or defensive? Maybe Jonathan, you want to take this?
No, I think when you present trade-offs to people, you don't necessarily need to look like you're trying to take a stand on one or another. It's simply being very objective to say there are different groups with different interests, right? All of you are in the same room now. There are competing interests in this room, right? And you could even have people speak for themselves to talk about the interests, have them represent their own interests, right? And then people understand, okay, there are people with different views from me, right? So then I feel like these different voices will start to balance each other out a little bit more. And that helps the government. The government has to do even less when people are brought together to see that there are people who have, like I said, different views from them, right?
Yeah, George, how do you see the government trying to kind of explain the trade-offs to people, Singaporeans, without sounding paternalistic or defensive?
What we do see, I think, in these two cases is that there's a lot of, I think, very interesting conversations happening already in town halls and all that. And in a lot of this, sessions and all, you will see, I think, policymakers, MPs, right, I think, talking about trade-offs and explaining it. And it's interesting, right, because in a lot of this, like sort of behind the scenes sort of interactions, you get to see, I think, different ways of explaining trade-offs, right? There are MPs, for example, who go in a room not explaining the government position. They just want to go in there, they just want to hear what residents say. And as fellow Singaporeans, right, they talk about what possible, needs, aspirations that may counter each other. And I think this is the kind of conversation Singaporeans want, right? They want to not just say there is a trade-off. They want to know what the trade-offs are and where do my maybe interest, aspiration lie in all this equation, and figuring out why eventually a certain, decision was made, right? In that grand scheme of things. This, I think, is where there is a possibility where, maybe more such conversations can happen for more residents, for more stakeholders, so that it allows, I think, people to figure out, right, I think, where their comments or their feedback is valued as well, which is so important.
I do think if you show people the process, they become more accepting.
It is, yes.
So what does it say about our society today, about what they expect of government? Because I think we've already established that the government of today cannot just say, trust me, bro, and then expect people to say, okay, I trust you. I mean, it doesn't work that way anymore. And actually, we're moving beyond Maju Forest. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen this happen with most recently with the Dear You movie, and people wanted to get an explanation of why do we need to hold on to this bilingual policy that doesn't really serve us today, and we've moved beyond that. And so I guess the government knows best stance doesn't work. So what does it say about us today and what we expect of the government?
Right. So actually, I see this in a very interesting parallel. This idea of trust me, bro, right? I think on the one hand, we do still see the citizens and stakeholders trusting the government in terms of what I call policy powers, right? The ability to make good policies, the ability to, I think, hold the process really well. We don't see that in a lot of other countries, right? Where the citizens have really lost trust in government in those areas. In Singapore, we still see that. And it's great because it means that citizens know that if a process is being done, if certain things are being done well, the government will act upon it, right? And there is, that outcome that we see. What I think residents or stakeholders want some more would be what I call policy partnership, right? Where what they want is now trusting that you can make really good decisions. Give me that platform to voice, right? Give me the platform to share my concerns and all that, so that in the process of doing so, it goes, into somewhere fruitful. And then this is where the sort of contestation is right now, right? What kind of policy partnership should we imagine in the future beyond what is already available right now? And this is such an interesting spot, right, for both policymakers and for stakeholders to consider, right? What are some of the ways we can engage that are not already done, and what kind of new policy co-designing can we get out of this altogether too?
Jonathan, what changed? Because would you say the expectation of the government has shifted compared to older generations?
To some extent. From my own observations, as well as the views of the younger people who reach out to me on TikTok or other platforms, I think there's much less of a blind, unquestioning deference to institutions and to authority than before, right? I think there's an expectation of institutions to continuously earn trust through visible responsiveness. And it's not just government. I think it's all institutions that are affected by this, right? Which is not a bad thing. Right, because I think it's incumbent, or it puts a bit of pressure on institutions to earn that trust, rather than assume automatic legitimacy based on their status or their track record, right? To continue to demonstrate rather than to assume their relevance.
George, do you also feel like something shifted? And are you able to pinpoint a moment where suddenly, it's not suddenly, I'm sure it's a gradual shift, but what changed among the different generations in Singapore that now more people, and actually, to be fair to the older generations, actually, when I was reading the stories that came out and people were interviewed, they were not young. They were not younger people only who came out to say, hey, I want Maju Forest to be retained, or I want some greenery. There were people in their 60s, in their 50s who were saying, hey, I want to be consulted, about this. So I was just wondering, where did people, realize that, hey, actually, I have a voice and the government will engage with me?
I think for the longest time, it's always been a room, right, where policymakers would have to bring in, I think, stakeholders to have such discussion. In the past, that room could be really small, could be really privileged, right? Closed doors even. But over time, I think that room has expanded. The type of the rooms have, blossomed. Different people have, come into that space as well. And if there's a way to pinpoint it, like Jonathan mentioned, it'll be, 2011, 2012. That would be where a lot of, things have happened politically, right? And that has made the government realize this is a time, right, where we know that society is, not just ready, but want more, of these opportunities. And since then, I think that whole consultative government approach have been very much, that push, right, the progression to scale that room much bigger, make the doors a lot wider for people to come in. And of course, what you would eventually get also will be stakeholders raising their hands and say, I want to be part of that process as well. Sometimes they may say it in a way that is also, a little bit sort of, cynical, right? They'll be like, oh, government's not listening to me. What it may just mean is, please also listen to me, right? And I think that's fine, because then if governments are able to relate that and say, okay, yeah, that's like maybe code word for invite, or include them as well, then the room inevitably will get bigger, more people will be in it. And of course, once you're in that room, then there's also a different set of expectations, right? How do you work with others? How do you, roll up your sleeve to do the nitty-gritty stuff, which may not be very, very exciting, right? It's not going to end up on the front page of a newspaper and all that. But I think that's where policymaking matters.
But I'm kind of interested because now so many people want to have their voices heard, right? So how does the government, and also with different issues, you have different special interest groups, because if you look at Maju Forest and Gillman Barracks, there are different nature groups that are vested and they're interested. So how does the government actually choose who to listen to? I mean, how many opinions on the ground should they consider? And I'm looking at you, Jonathan, because you might have some take on how the government decides who to listen to rather.
Yeah, I think increasingly, simply because there are so many competing interests on any one issue, right? I think anytime a ministry or a department is tasked with looking into an issue, they need to understand that their ministry isn't the only one that has to make a say on this, right? So I think this whole government mindset, which the public service has been trying to inculcate in its public servants for a while, is something that we need to continue to cherish and to encourage, right? So when say one ministry is like MND is looking into this Maju Forest issue, they need to appreciate, look, the sustainability becomes an issue as well. And maybe go out to all the different ministries to say, hey, what are the competing interests that you think, right, need to be factored into this equation? And then from there, who are the relevant stakeholders and experts that we need to talk to, as opposed to we only talk to the same group of stakeholders in our domain, in our niche area. I think that would help.
Yeah. And I mean, following from that as well, it's not just, what kind of decisions do the governments need to have in order to make such, to decide who to speak to. It's also, the onus is also, sometimes on the civil society groups themselves. How do you position yourself in this in this matter? What are your interests? What are your stakes? Right? I think as you make those things clearer, it becomes a tango, or like a dance, right? Like government officials, agencies would then reach out to them precisely because there are things that they think needs or is worth hearing, right? So this is where I think both sides have something to also offer in this whole conversation for sure.
Oh, I'm curious, if I want to start a civil society group, how do I get the government to take me seriously?
Hire Jonathan.
Not a plug for Jonathan's services here, but is that what needs to be done? Like, find some sort of middle ground.
I think first and foremost would be find that common voice, right? Because I think how civil society groups emerge and all that is because people have common aspiration for certain things. These things will be really niche. For example, some of the groups that I work with, groups like Urban Bird Initiative and all that. These are groups that are very niche, right? They care for certain specific things that maybe not everyone concerned about. But that's a good start. Finding something that you think you care about, finding common ground, people coming in, and then over time you build up a scale, a mass, and then you start to ask yourself, what is that interest you have, right? What do you want to change in this world? What are some things you are willing to work, for, right? And once you have that sort of angle, right, your organizational goal and all that, that's where you can then position yourself. This becomes your, your brand personality of sorts. And when the time comes for certain policies, for example, if the government is thinking about changing the Pest Control Act, for instance, right, and birds are involved, this is where you become one of the, sort of invited, or you may even raise your hand and say, I know something about this space, and you should hear me out. I think this is so important because now we're in that space where, if you look into the civil society group, sometimes there are some groups which are a lot more established, a lot more, I think, vocal as well. But there are others with credible, interesting feedback, right, that may not receive that attention or that oxygen that actually needs to be in that room too.
And I think credibility is one of those things that has been on my mind as well, following your question, right? I think anytime you go into any sort of negotiation, right, you need to be able to demonstrate to the other party, right, they're not coming in with extreme views, and that you genuinely want to be able to shape an outcome that's better. In this case, better for society at large, right? So I don't necessarily have to insist on my views, or things don't necessarily have to go my way all the time, but they have to be a better outcome than today. And I think once you can demonstrate to the government, right, that's what we are trying to achieve, rather than you have to always do things the way I want them to, the government will be a bit more willing to accept and to listen and to have that debate and discussion with you.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great segue to what I want to find out about social media, because I'm kind of curious how much of this voices or active citizenry is actually fueled by social media. I mean, we cannot ignore the fact that a lot of things get amplified when it's put on platforms because people post and then they reshare content. And it's also an easier way for younger Singaporeans to get involved in policy making. So I'm curious how much of it is amplified on social media versus like whether people are actually interested in it.
Look, if I may take that first. The root cause of this is not social media in and of itself, right? I think it's just that the electorate or the people are getting more educated and therefore more vocal, right? But social media is a platform or a medium for people to channel their voices, right? And I think increasingly people are seeing that, hey, there are other people out there who have the same kind of views as me.
Yeah, you can find your tribe, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And in addition to that, social media also tends to provide a veil of anonymity, right? And all of these together embolden people to speak up a bit more. But the downside to that is that it also shifts people, because of how the way the algorithm works, shifts people towards slightly more extreme views, right? So then social media starts to polarize, and I think that's one of the downsides of social media. But definitely the amplification effect of social media is one of those things that, like I said, emboldens people to try and speak up a bit more.
Yeah, it's really the ramp, right? It's the one that ramps up, I think, attention, which is the reason why I think both Gillman Barracks, Maju Forest, have been in the consciousness of a lot of people. But I think one of the things that also I think the public needs to be aware about is that what you see on social media need to be what is the interest being articulated only, right? Because the algorithms will feed you the, your biases and all that.
Yeah.
And if you assume that, hey, the rest of the world is actually on my side, right? Like, why are we?
It's very self-reinforcing.
It is. It's very, very scary. It's echo chamber of sort. Because when you get actually into that room, that policymaking room, you will see a lot of different interests. You will see a lot of different things that you might not even imagine. Like, take for example, there was one of this town hall session that I went. It was on sustainability, basically, right? It's a broader topic. Of course, people are talking about Maju Forest-Gillman Barracks then. But the residents in the room, they were like, we care about sustainability, but sustainability in our world would be things like traffic congestion. But we think like, is there pollution that will affect, my livability if I was in the neighborhood and things like that? And I think those also matter. But those will never end up in the social media space because no one would like to hear the boring, grouses of residents and all that. But those do matter to the lives of residents. So in other words, right, social media is a great, platform to ramp up, interest, to know really what people are saying in the voices. But we cannot take that as a litmus test of what the aspirations and expectations are in society.
I mean, for me personally, when I see these debates kind of play out online, I dislike it very much because it often degenerates. And as you mentioned, it becomes combative. It becomes downright rude sometimes. I mean, there's a lot of name calling or you slag off the other side. And then it's this thing about this word woke is now a bad thing. Like if you're woke, you're the vocal minority, you're a greenie. Sometimes you get called a PAP dog or you get like called an oppie. Like it's kind of creative in a bad way, but it's what does it do to the argument when the labels start coming out? Yeah.
The currency of social media is attention, right? And extremeness breeds attention on social media at least, right? And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, so people feel emboldened simply because they feel like, okay, no one's going to know who's saying all of this, right? So that veil of anonymity, right? It makes people take more hardened, more extreme views as well, I think.
But do you think that it then puts off people who have something to say when they now they look at it and they're like, oh, this is kind of becoming a bit murky. It's kind of becoming a bit, for lack of a better word, it's a bit gross. I don't want to be involved in this. So does it put off people with legitimate views? What do you think, George?
I don't want to be part of this cesspit.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And then people with proper suggestions or real issues, then they say, actually, I'm just going to sit this one out.
Correct. Yeah. So that's why I think it's so important, I think, for policymakers, stakeholders to also think about the various rooms that they can build to bring conversations in. The social media clearly is not the room that, we want to have only, right, as the exclusive place for these feedback to be driven, because like you've mentioned, it will often devolve into some kind of, name calling, sort of mudslinging. And again, like, John mentioned, this is the the currency of social media. This is how social media works today. So what we therefore need is, especially those of us who are activists, stakeholders who want to, I think, really move policymaking in a co-creative, consensus-driven process. Build your own rooms, build your own tables to have conversations outside of those places, right? And I see a lot of fellow advocates and do that as well. Some of them just say, ring up their best friends and people whom they know they're concerned about this, say, hey, let's have a coffee chat together, right? Just no one, like everyone's coming in as just a human being and a Singaporean. Let's have a conversation about what you think about this. You may not be staying there. You may be, a resident of Maju or Gillman, but let's have that conversation. And it's great because then people who maybe have some kind of feedback but may not always find their place in social media and all that can then articulate their views.
Yeah.
And then those become, I think that real genuine human connection that we want to see in policymaking.
Yeah, I guess that's what the government tried to do with things like our Singapore conversation as well, right? So smaller group in-person discussions to encourage people to speak out a bit more, right? But also there's a natural mechanism in such groups that forces people not to take too extreme views because they'll often be counterbalanced almost immediately by other people in that same group, right? So I think that's a kind of conversation that we need to try to encourage.
Precisely. It's the civil in civil society.
Yes.
And can we be? Because,
yes.
so we've clearly established that Singaporeans want more say in things of the way the country goes, right? But do we know how to disagree agreeably?
Oh, ye of little faith. Of course we do. Surely.
Must ask, because I mean, a lot of my worldview is informed by, I mean, it's just the nature of the job as well. Like, you just see what's happening on social media and you're tracking what people say on Reddit, and then I'm just like,
Terrible benchmark for, I think.
not a good benchmark.
Yes,
All right, I got to
for
get out
sure.
and talk to some people, which is why I'm very proud of the
Touch
people in like Teluk Blangah, because they came together, they set up dialogues and they spoke to their MP, and things changed, right? As in, to some extent, they managed to, secure,
They organize, they mobilize.
yeah, and even the people who were campaigning for Maju Forest. So I am like, wow, okay, example.
It is optimistic, right?
Yeah.
But then again, at the same time, this is not unique, right? There is a recipe for it. It's about how you get people with common mindset together, build credibility, build the mobilization, have a decent conversation with stakeholders, policymakers involved, and this is, I think, where Singapore still has that thing, right? The trust in the policy powers, trust that when the process is happening, it will get to certain outcomes that you can eventually see that you have made that difference. Whether it's a big difference or small difference is another question altogether, but at least, right, that mechanism, the policy mechanism is working.
So to your question, Singaporeans absolutely have the capacity to be measured. It's a question of whether they have the platforms. It's about creating those platforms, providing them with the platforms to be able to demonstrate how measured they can be, I think.
Do we kind of need something different now? Because as you've mentioned our Singapore conversations that was in 2012 and 2020, and then we've also had the Forward Singapore conversations, right? Do we need a third iteration of this, or do we need something completely different to hear, as you said, find platforms, or is there a completely different way of engaging citizens and hearing them?
I feel like our Singapore conversation, Forward Singapore, were quite generic about people's aspirations and goals and concerns, right? But I think on issues, I think we might need these issues-based platforms as well, right? For people to be able to concentrate and focus on one particular topic in order to have discourse on it, right? Because then it becomes a bit more effective, more meaningful. People can share their views on that one thing rather than broadly, what are my aspirations for Singapore?
So are you saying like topic-based, like, okay, if you're involved in sustainability and the environment, let's find that platform, or if you're interested in cost of living issues, then let's come together on that. Is that what you mean?
Yes, but also maybe for like the Maju Forest issue, right? You have a discussion around Maju Forest itself. So it comes back again to what we were discussing earlier about creating those platforms, involving people a bit more upstream in that policy-making process, right? Having them speak about their views on this one issue, again, as opposed to something very broad, like, what are your aspirations for Singapore? Which starts to get a bit abstract.
And it's, I think, moving from national conversations like this, like Jonathan mentioned, to really conversation as a policy tool, right? Where every time we have something, we don't need to gather the national consensus to have this. Right? It could be policymakers now know this is a very useful tool I can use to communicate and co-create policy, right? And to do it in their various scale, capacity, whatever issues that they're facing and all that. So this is what I hope to see, and I see that is also heading that direction. Things like our Singapore conversation and Forward Singapore becoming a quintessential part of policymaking, right? The communicating, co-creation and consensus making kind of process, being a part of it.
So is there still a place for maybe perhaps government-led platforms like Reach? Because if people are organizing themselves on the ground, then should we just leave it to what people want to speak up about? I
think this is where Reach can become that middle person, right, to build those platforms even more. So they don't just have to, I think just listen to people, right, in the way that they did. Now they can play that more active role as well. Why not build those spaces and all that? In fact, Reach has been doing that, right? In the universities, for example, they no longer just, I think in the past, Reach would do surveys and all that. Today, there will be, let's put bubble tea there, get young people sit down, right, in the middle of the university concourse and say, let's have a conversation. I think that's great, right? Because each and every ministry, agencies would find their niche, right, and know how to reach out to stakeholders in various capacities.
Yeah. It's about facilitating those discussions, I think.
So I want to end off on this question about, given how we started out with the Maju Forest-Gillman Barracks conversation, it's been going on for a couple of weeks now. What do you think the government can take away from the whole conversation? And on the flip side, what can citizens actually do to make Singapore-style advocacy work better?
I think on the government side, I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record here, but it's about bringing people into the process at a much more upstream phase. It's about bringing people in earlier and explaining to people all your considerations, right? Some of the challenges that you're facing, because there are different groups with different competing interests here, right? On the citizen side, one thing I hope they don't take away from this is the only way that the government will listen to me is if I take very extreme views and I scream a lot on social media. I hope that's not what our society will degenerate into, because I think that's just unhealthy, right? But I think once the government can demonstrate that they are willing to try and listen to people a bit more at an earlier phase, then citizens will automatically be encouraged to be a bit more active, a bit more participative in this whole process. And I think that would be helpful.
I think for me, it would be the takeaway for government here would be that people actually trust the government in terms of the policy process, but like Jonathan mentioned, the trust has to be earned every time. The trust has to be earned in every single policy issue matter that comes up. So this is where it is always like the game of sort of building the credibility on both sides for sure. And regardless of that, I think is that people still do think that our government is an efficient one, is a capable one. And this is the reason why they have not cut off, communication. Like in other countries, you see very combative relationships between, the state and, its people. Here, I think we are very fortunate, right, to still have those kinds of trusts in, the whole process and the legitimacy of the institution in itself. For citizens, I think apart from, not thinking that, screaming gets your way, the inverse is also very true, right? There have been a lot of local, sort of mobilization and all that. And I hope that citizens can learn that this is actually really, really useful way of, I think building credibility, building, your voice. And, my hope is for advocates and activists out there, go and join. I mean, the Hom Ling Park, thing was a good, I would say, visibility of people who care for this. Don't just end there. Go join a group. Go, roll up your sleeve, be part of the conversation, see what you can, contribute to, be part of that, consensus making process and all that. Because this is where, advocacy and activism becomes, I think in some ways useful, right, for the greater good of society as well. Yeah.
So I want to thank you both for your insights today, and I'm sure our audience, glean some of their own insights about how to advocate for what they believe in. But, just running us off, I really like the thing that you said about, Jonathan, that you said about the social compact has changed. I think we need to realize that that has happened and that Singaporeans want to feel like their voices matter and that it will impact policy outcomes, right? And George, you also said that, Singaporeans still trust the government, but they want to be more involved, and people should be prepared to go to discussions, willing to make some concessions or see the other person's point of view and then come to find some common ground. Just be civil. That's very good advice for today. So I hope people will not be screaming about what they want, but, take away some of these viewpoints from both of you guys today. So thank you both for being here. And that's it for this week. Now, if you have a take on today's episode, drop me a note in the comment section on YouTube, Spotify, or Instagram and tell me what you think. And if you like the episode, do share it with someone else. I will see you next week.